The Oatman Family. You may have heard of the Oatman Massacre, or seen pictures of all of Oatman. But even if you haven't, it's important we know a little bit about the events leading up to our story and the characters involved. Royce Oatman, Olive's father. Royce Oatman is an American story. He was born in 1809. For context, others born that same year include Abraham Lincoln, Charles Darwin, both on February 12th, writer Edgar Allan Poe, and American frontiersman Christopher Kit Carson. Royce was the fourth of 17 children of Lyman and Lucy Oatman. He was of Dutch ancestry by way of Holland to New York City in the late 1600s. Royce's grandfather and great-grandfather both fought in the American Revolution on the side for independence. Royce's ancestors eventually moved to Vermont, then upstate New York. We might now think of them as a typical white, landed Christian family of the time. Royce grew up working on the farm and had some schooling. Raised Methodist, Royce was strongly influenced by an especially enthusiastic preacher from his youth named Lorenzo Dow, who would keep congregations enraptured for hours. He would later name his first son Lorenzo Dow after this preacher. In 1832, while living in Illinois, Royce married Mary Ann Sperry. He was 23, she was 18. Soon after Royce and Mary Ann married came the kids. Lucy in 1834, Lorenzo Dow in 1836, Olive in 1837, Mary Ann, named for her mother, in 1843, Royce Jr. in 1846, Charity Ann in 1848, and Roland in 1849. When Royce and Mary Ann Oatman take their journey west in 1850 to 1851, they will have 7 children and another on the way. Joseph Smith. Royce grew up in the middle of what was later called the Second Great Awakening. This movement was one of revivals and emotional preaching spanning several regions of the United States. It was a highly competitive environment for local churches and preachers. Both Royce and his wife Mary Ann and the respective families were Mormon, or Latter-day Saints. The founder of this faith was Joseph Smith. Only a few years older than Royce, Smith published his Book of Mormon in 1830. He had claimed that this book came from his own translation of golden plates he had found buried on his family farm in upstate New York. Footnote: I'll leave the formal beliefs and doctrines of the LDS Church to others. But know in those early days of preaching, Smith spoke of receiving revelations directly from God, that he and his followers were to build a place of gathering, a new Jerusalem. This will have a big impact later on in our story, and American history for that matter. After building quite a following and a host of critics to match, Smith was killed alongside his brother while awaiting trial in Carthage, Illinois, in 1844. His successor as leader of the church was not yet established, and a bit of a schism ensued, with different leaders attempting to take the reins. Among many of the hot issues at hand was their views on the practice of plural marriage. Royce himself was sticking to the faith, but he couldn't find a leader he was confident in. Royce's in-laws, the Sperrys, chose to follow Brigham Young, who, in 1847, would lead thousands of Mormons west to the present-day Salt Lake region. Apparently, Royce and his father-in-law had a falling out over this disagreement, which couldn't have been easy on his wife Mary Ann. Books on the subject describe a particularly gruesome warning/prediction from Royce that now puts him in some bad light. His father-in-law, mother-in-law, and brother-in-law would in fact soon die in the trek west. However, the gruesome details of Royce's alleged warnings more closely resemble what would eventually happen to his household in the coming months. James Colin Brewster. James Colin Brewster was born in New York in 1826, which made him about 17 years younger than Royce. James and his parents were also members of the Mormon Church. Similar to Joseph Smith, he was a precocious kid who, similar to Joseph Smith, had visions, including one about lost books of an ancient prophet. Similar to Joseph Smith, he claimed to be called upon by God to translate these books. And similar to Joseph Smith, this was done in secret with little to no witnesses. Footnote: my aim of highlighting the similarities between Smith and Brewster is not to tease about their specific beliefs, but instead to make clear why Smith and the leaders of the church did not take so kindly to this young upstart, Brewster, who was not yet a teenager when he began writing/translating these books. It was during these writings, translations, that Brewster received a revelation from God that the Mormons should move to a place called the Land of Bashan. The Land of Bashan. Despite Smith's declining to accept these writings, people started to notice and come by the house to meet and speak with this boy prophet. You can probably see what's coming here, but in 1842, Brewster received a revelation that he should publish his writings, including some that were critical of the current church leadership. Smith's administration ruled these claims as humbug, my words, as only Smith was ordained to receive revelations from God. But Brewster kept writing. He was still a believer in the Mormon faith, including the Book of Mormon, translated and written by Smith. But he was critical of the prophet and his policy of plural marriage. In the years that followed Smith's death in 1844, Brewster, still just out of his teens, revealed that he now knew the location for this new gathering place, this land of Bashan, for the Mormons to move to. The location was at the confluence of the Colorado and Gila rivers near the present-day Arizona-California border. We don't know when the Oatman family officially joined the Brewsterites, as Brewster's followers were called, but when the call went out for pioneers to join this endeavor, Royce Oatman immediately began preparations, selling his farm and even traveling the area proselytizing on behalf of this new Mormon sect. These Latter-day Saints set a plan to arrive in the land of Bashan in 1851. It's tempting to think, what was this guy doing? He already had a decent life with a family and a farm, and now he's going to risk it all on the word of this boy prophet? We, of course, already know this story is not going to end well for Royce and his family. But we have to remember that none of this story we now know was inevitable. Royce knew there were some serious risks, but he was a believer, not just in his faith, but in himself, and his ability to get his family to a promised land for a better life. There was also plenty of violence and persecution suffered by Mormons during this time, so staying put had no guarantee of safety either. You know, we tend to think of the Mayflower when we think of pilgrims, but that's what Royce and his family were. In fact, the story of the Oatmans and the other Brewsterite families parallels those Mayflower pilgrims quite closely. Both groups were devout believers, both called themselves saints, both were risking their life and the lives of their families to establish a new society where they could worship how they pleased. And we tend to admire those earlier pilgrims. Unfortunately, for our story, the parallels continue on the negative side as well. The Oatmans and the other Brewsterite families would also be unprepared, traveling late in the season, and ultimately, some of them are not going to survive the first winter. In the next section, 1,500 miles to the land of Bashan. The Santa Fe Trail. Divisions within the group. But before moving on, take a minute and put yourselves in the shoes of the Oatman family, the Brewsterites, or really any pioneers moving west in the 1800s. What do you think those weeks and months leading up to the trip were like for them? Excitement? Worries? Were they mainly focused on logistics, like packing lists and payload, like we do today? Talk it over with your group, and when you're ready, go ahead and play the next section, 1,500 miles to Bashan, 1850.